Well, thank you for being here. We're so excited to kick off this conversation. Please continue to drop into the chat who you are and where you're from. And we will get started with this conversation. And to cover a couple of quick things before we get into it, navigating changing laws on voter registration is why we're here today. So I would love to just start our conversation by of course, announcing that this webinar is being recorded because that's the number one question that we get. So please put your Q&A section, your questions into the Q&A section of the webinar. So you see it on the bottom of Zoom. If you have any questions throughout, which I'm sure you will, please ask in the Q&A. That is going to be super helpful so that we can make sure to capture all of those at the end when we get to our Q&A section. When we are having this conversation, please feel free to drop in your emojis. We'd love to know that you are listening. And of course, if you have any questions, jot them down or just drop them into the Q&A. But again, this webinar is being recorded. The information that we're giving you today is super valuable. So we want to make sure that you're getting everything that you need. And for those who are not able to attend, they will still receive this information. So thank you so much again for being here. So a little bit of our overview for today. We have our highlights. We are setting the stage for this discussion. 2026 is a big year, if you haven't noticed. There's a lot going on. So we want to make sure that you have the most accurate information about voting legislation in your state. We will not cover all 50 states in this conversation. I do want to manage expectations there. We don't have enough time to cover all 50 states, but what we have done, if you've joined this conversation last year or the year prior, is we try to divide these states by maybe the states that have the most restrictive versus the states that have the most moderate voting legislation. So again, we encourage you to go to the state guide so that you can fill yourself in, but we will cover what are the key highlights for 2026. Of course, we will have our Q&A. So make sure to drop in those questions into the Q&A box, and then we'll cover some tools and resources and what's next. But in the meantime, please feel free to continue dropping in your information into the chat. So, some reminders. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, as I'm sure many of you are. 501c3s can only engage candidates on a nonpartisan basis. So, none of the content in this webinar should be interpreted as legal advice. We cannot answer any legal questions. And if you seek legal advice, please consult an attorney. We are being joined today by Michelle Cantor-Cohen from Fair Election Center. She is the policy director and senior counsel. Michelle is a near and dear partner of Nonprofit Vote and National Voter Registration Day, so we wanted to make sure to invite her back every single year to be able to answer all of your questions around the voting legislation for each state. So we're so excited to have Michelle as part of this conversation. But before I hand it over to Michelle, Nonprofit Vote, as a reminder, is the organization that equips you all to provide nonpartisan tools and resources to help the communities that you serve participate in voting and democracy. That is our number one mission. We envision a diverse network of nonprofits across the U.S. with the skills, resources, and commitment needed to foster a more inclusive democracy. So all of this work is completely nonpartisan, and we hope that you are able to engage with the resources and learn a thing or two today. I'm sure many of you have partnered with Nonprofit Vote in the past or National Voter Registration Day. So to those of you, welcome back. And if you are brand new, we have lots and lots to share. So get your notepad ready. And in terms of what we hope you'll take from today's webinar, we hope that you'll take, number one, an understanding of the guides and what they cover, so what they are and what they are not, how to use the state's guides confidently to plan your voter registration events. I know many of you are starting to put together the pieces for your National Voter Registration Day event on September 15th. So thank you so much for that. A working knowledge of major voting law changes in 2026 2026. That is probably the most pertinent information. Again, we will not cover all 50 states, but we will get to as many as we can. And then we also want to make sure that you have some of the talking points about 2026 midterms to train your volunteers and to be able to confidently respond to questions. So here we go without further ado. So now let's set the stage for this discussion. Oh my goodness, 2026, huh? Um, we are really excited to have you all here, but we have to kind of make sure that we cover some of the ground rules and some of the background. So we have to remind ourselves that even in uncertain times, our communities are still showing up, right? So if democracy is persisting, we have to persist. And we understand that the fear and the confusion are real, but so is our resilience. That's why we're here. That's why there's 200 of you on this webinar right now. Thank you so much for your dedication. Thank you for the commitment. It's more important now than ever. So despite those new barriers, despite the disinformation, despite the political polarization, we are still coming together to do this work because we still believe in the power of our vote and our voice, and we have to empower our communities to do so. So there's a lot happening in 2026 in terms of midterm elections. There's a lot of seats that are up. And we have a lot of important information to get out to our communities, right? But all of this work is still nonpartisan. We have to make sure that we keep that at the center of our work. We are creating a welcoming space where all eligible citizens, regardless of party, identity, or background, feel safe to participate, especially this year. And then lastly, there's always a heightened need to protect our community. So when you help someone talk about civic engagement, or you register them to vote, or you encourage them to vote early, you're not just checking a box. You really are helping to claim power over their decisions that affect schools and housing and safety and jobs. 2026 has showed us that these elections matter for policy more than ever before. So, and they're impacting our everyday lives. We know that these local and state elections will directly impact our communities in very significant and substantial ways. So we want to make sure that you use these resources to create accessible relationships with your communities and make sure that you're bringing new voters into the conversation right where they live. So with all of that, what it comes down to is this. We are we want you to make sure that you walk away from this conversation with these three things, right? You got to know your community. You got to know your stuff. So when I say stuff, that means you got to know your resources and you got to know what you're talking about in terms of your voting laws. And then you have to use your tools. So as a trusted organization, have a deep understanding of the community that you serve. It will show confidence and it will help build trust. Know your stuff. So voting rules have changed for many states and they change year to year. So make sure that you are well versed in voter registration legislation before you start planning your drive. And then lastly, we have created all of the tools for you across Nonprofit Vote and National Voter Registration Day. We want to make sure that you use them. So as part of this conversation, we will revisit some of those tools and resources. No need to reinvent the wheel, just plug and play. But we want to make sure that you know what's available to you. Sound good? Okay, so without further ado, now I get the honor of handing this over to Michelle Cantor-Cohen. She is from the Fair Election Center, and every year we work together to create these guides to make sure they are accurate and to make sure that they are extremely useful for you all. So without further ado, Michelle.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me back, Cheyenne. It's always great to be here and see all the folks all over the country who are working on civic engagement and getting folks engaged just everywhere, all over the place. So I am here to tell you about our registration drive guides. First, I'm going to say a little bit about Fair Election Center. So we are a nonpartisan 501c3 dedicated to defending, expanding, and facilitating voting rights. We use advocacy, litigation, organizing, education, and technology to protect and expand the right to vote. And we understand that voting rights issues have a particular impact on disenfranchised, underrepresented, and marginalized communities. Through our unique partnerships with hundreds of campuses across the country, we are able to empower millions of new voters to participate in our democracy. And our litigation and advocacy efforts across dozens of states allow us to anticipate and counteract threats to free and fair elections. I have to start my section as well with a legal disclaimer. We provide information and best practices in our guides and website. We can't provide legal advice as part of this presentation or in the guides. If you find that you do need legal advice, please contact an attorney admitted to the bar in your state. So why help others register to vote? We're looking at these guides, which are focused on helping our neighbors, helping our communities register to vote. Why do that? So people trust leaders and community members within their own communities. This is really about trust. Local organizations are trusted sources of information, and we can reach people who have never even been asked to register to vote before. In addition, we can help people with the logistics of getting forms turned in, which is a barrier for a lot of folks. Um, so a key thing to know about doing voter registration is that voter registration rules vary from state to state, and they really vary quite widely. There are a few sort of mostly universal elements of it. You can't vote in state and federal elections if you're not a United States citizen. That's true everywhere. You can't vote if you're not registered, except in the one state we don't have a guide for, which is North Dakota, which does not have traditional voter registration, but all the other ones you have to register to vote before you vote. And there's no national registration system. So every state maintains its own voter registration system, process, forms. There is a federal registration form in most states, but the rules are really state by state. And that's about many different aspects of voter registration. And it's all based on where you live. So our library of guides is updated every year in cooperation, as Cheyenne said, with Nonprofit Vote for National Voter Registration Day. And the guides outline the protocol for holding voter registration drives in every state. And that's really talking about, when I say voter registration drives, I'm really referring to the process of helping people register to vote, helping them fill out the form, collecting the form, and turning it in to the election official. So these guides detail the state-by-state rules and regulations for organizations planning to host voter registration events, drives, and whatnot. So, for most accurate info, always it's a good practice to check with your local elections office, as well as the Secretary of State's website, as your primary source. That's our primary source, our laws and the election official information coming directly from election officials. And you'll see the link on the bottom. So I want to talk about what is included in these guides. What do you get? So first of all, key dates and registration deadlines. Both the deadlines that apply specifically to drives as well as the general voter registration deadline. We also have in here the links to state registration forms and other resources for doing voter registration work. And we include the state-specific requirements, including in a number of states, deadlines that are specific to voter registration drives to turn in forms that are different from the general registration deadline for a voter doing it on their own. Rules about registering the drive or the person collecting a form with the election official that exist in a number of states. There are also rules about training. Training is important for every voter registration event and drive, but some states require you to get the training from the election official. So when we say training rules, that's really what we're flagging for you. And then there are some states that have rules about how canvassers, volunteers can be paid or stipended, and restrictions on who can collect forms in some states. So why are the guides important? We talked about the importance of voter registration generally. So the guides, they're really an educational tool for organizations, staff, and volunteers to use before running a registration drive. And as I mentioned, there really is wide variation in state laws. And some states have a lot of restrictions. Some states have just maybe a few rules. And some states require organizations to register in advance. So you have to know that before you start your program. And as you're planning your program or your event, it's really important to know what you have to do ahead of time in order to set it up. Get in touch with the election office, or get folks trained in order to run your program. Um, and then there are a few states, I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but there are a few states that don't allow third parties to conduct voter registration drives at all. So a little bit about how to use the guide. So it's really a planning tool. As I said, so before your drive, you want to read through the guide, familiarize yourself with those rules. The deadline, super, super critical. I can't emphasize the deadlines enough because that's how, that's how you're helping people get registered in time for the election is to make sure that the applications are on time. Um, and allowing the having the volunteers have access to the guides might help also to highlight important information for them. Having printed copies handy might help to just keep everyone on the same page and knowing what they need to do. And so if you are collecting printed forms, follow the instructions closely for how to submit them. Different states tell you different things about where they need to be submitted. There are a few states that have specific rules about mailing or turning them in that you should look for. And then we'll go back to the deadlines again. It's so important. I really can't say enough. But to plan around the deadlines to allow enough time for processing forms and turning them in on time. Um, and it is best practice to set up a meeting with election officials in the locality you're in to set expectations for everyone and confirm being on the same page as far as the rules. So wanted to talk a little bit more about get into the details of the restrictions in different states, and information that you need to know to sort of figure out where your state kind of fits in. So, unfortunately, there are a few states that have really a lot of rules and restrictions or very bureaucratic. Among them are Georgia, Florida, New Mexico, and Texas. So, if you are in those states, definitely take a look at the guide and make sure you know all the different things that apply in your state. Um, there are other states that I would, categorize as moderately restrictive, that have rules around receiving the forms, how people can be compensated, the turnaround time for registration drives, things like that. That includes California, Virginia, and Maryland as examples. And then there are some states that are not restrictive that have sort of few rules. That are specific to community voter registration. For example, rules that apply only to compensation or to whether someone can be provided with a pre-filled form. Um, that includes states like Michigan, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania. Um, One important thing to flag, and particularly this year, I'll say a little bit about that, a little more about that in a few minutes. But there are some states that have documentary proof requirements to register to vote in some elections or all elections in their state. And unfortunately, that list has expanded this year. And so I want to highlight that for you. Arizona has been a state with documentary proof requirements for some time. Um, but Mississippi, South Dakota, and Utah have recently added documentary proof requirements. And then Wisconsin has a documentary proof of residence requirement that is unusual. Um, and then finally, there's category of states that don't allow third-party organizations to assist voters with registering at all. What you can do in those states really is education and GOTV. These are all same-day registration states where people still need to know how to register to vote and need to know about the documents that they need to register to vote in those states. So this is New Hampshire and Wyoming, and if you're doing work in those states, take a look. And that will just help you educate voters on how to register. So I could say a little bit more about the states with high levels of restrictions. I want to do that to make sure I'm flagging for you the types of rules that you should be looking out for. In Florida, organizations must register with the state and provide information about the organization and its employees before they can collect applications at all. So there are restrictions as well on who can serve as a canvasser. And there are specific deadlines that apply to so-called 3 PVROs, third party voter registration organizations, and that are different from the general deadlines. And there are a number of fines that apply if those deadlines are missed. Um, there is also a receipt requirement and certain information from the organization that must be provided on the voter registration forms themselves. There's really a lot going on in Florida. If you're interested in working there, definitely take a look to make sure you're on top of all of that. In Georgia, there are also a number of different requirements. Notices that have to be provided to every applicant. There's a forum for that basically on the Georgia website. There's also limits on information that can be kept by organizations, as well as specific deadlines and summary information that groups are asked to provide when they submit the forms. Um, We also have in this category New Mexico, where organizations have to register with the state. And each canvasser has to be a registration agent listed with the organization registration. So it's an individual canvasser level requirement. And that maybe might surprise folks who are not aware of that. So it's something to know. There are receipt requirements and a very tight turnaround time to submit forms as well. Definitely a place where it's important to talk with their county clerk if you're going to do voter registration work there. And then finally, in this category, Texas, where the canvasser who's collecting the application has to be deputized as a volunteer deputy registrar or VDR in the county where the registration applicant lives. So that's not necessarily where the canvasser lives. So if the canvasser lives in an area that's covered by multiple counties and wants to help people register in all those counties, it's not enough to just be a deputy registrar in the county where you live. You have to be a deputy registrar in the county of each applicant that you are helping to register. So you can't, in Texas, bundle registration applications and just send them in the mail. They have to be personally turned in by another, either yourself or another volunteer deputy registrar. Okay, so states with a more moderate set of rules. So California, organizations conducting voter registration have to follow different reporting rules and registration rules, depending on whether the canvassers are being paid. So take a look at that. There's also a drive specific deadline, as in many states. We have Maryland, which has some restrictions on who can serve as a canvasser in Maryland. Among other things, you have to be 18, and training requirements for people who get more than 25 forms from an election office. Virginia has a similar rule about requirements that apply if the org gets more than 25 forms from officials. They also have a receipt requirement and a drive specific deadline. So a few states, as mentioned earlier, have some rules related to compensation, such as a specific rule that people cannot be paid per registration form collected. Some of those examples are Michigan, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania. There are others as well. And I want to say that this rule is consistent with Fair Election Center's recommended best practices not to pay people per form collected. So that, you know, both the law as well as a best practice. And then some states also have rules that you can't mail someone a pre-filled form. Or that the person who is assisting has to put their own information on the registration form. Okay, so wanted to talk a little bit about documentary proof requirements because while they don't tend to explicitly reference voter registration drives in those types of laws, they have a huge impact on voter registration drives. So wanted to make sure to cover this. First of all, the SAVE Act has not passed at the federal level. I want to be really clear on that. There's certainly been a lot of discussion of the this is the show your papers to register to vote law. So it is not passed at the federal level. So the vast majority of Americans are not required to show documents in order to prove citizenship for voter registration. But there are an increasing number of states that, while they in theory allow registration drives, because of their state-specific documentary proof requirements, registration drives are difficult in those places. Arizona is one of those states because of its documentary proof of citizenship and documentary proof of residence requirements to vote in state and local elections and use the state form. Um, and then we can the next state here, which is Mississippi. They have a new law where registrants may have to provide documents to show citizenship if the officials can't determine their citizenship status using their driver's license or social security number. Um, and then next, we have Wisconsin, as mentioned, they have a proof of residence requirement, um, uh, except for military and overseas voters and online registrants who use a driver's license number. Um, another few states have newer rules as well on documentary proof of citizenship. South Dakota is one. They have a bifurcated system where voters have to provide documentary proof to vote in state and local elections. And that's a place, along with other places with documentary proof requirements, where coordinating with the election official to assist with events could help so that voters could show it to the official at the event. Of course, that's not, if you're doing work at a grocery store or a bus stop or one of those like in community places, that's really not it's not really a valuable option. But wanted to, let you know about that. And then Utah also has a bifurcated system, meaning that voters have different requirements to provide documents to vote in state and local elections versus federal elections. And then finally, I wanted to flag that Louisiana has a documentary proof of citizenship requirement in its laws, but at this point, state officials have told the federal court they're not currently enforcing it. So just wanted to let you know that. So, whatever you've heard in the news, you can just make sure you're up to date before doing work in Louisiana. So a couple states, coming back to this as promised, there are a couple of states with no third-party voter registration, meaning no, they don't allow people to collect others' voter registrations. That's New Hampshire, and Wyoming. So these are basically states that are focused on just the voter registering themselves, and in New Hampshire, very focused on in-person registration. Wyoming, just again, registration from the voter, with documentary proof requirements. And that brings us, I think, back to you, Cheyenne. So
Yeah.
looking forward to everyone's questions.
And Michelle, thank you so much. Every year, this is just such a valuable way to break down the key voting legislation changes. But I just want to reiterate, you should check with your local election office, your Secretary of State office, against the guides as well, because information, as we have seen, changes very quickly. So to make sure you have the most accurate information, check with your local election office before you do your voter drive, just as a last minute thing, we are going to allow some time for Q&A. I saw some Q&A come through in the chat. We don't want to answer it there because we don't want to lose the questions. And some of them are really important. So for those of you who have questions, drop them now into the Q&A. I'm seeing some questions come through, which is great. Jack just dropped into the chat the link again to the state guides. I know many of you may have questions that are state specific, so we are going to do our best to answer those. We do want to make sure that we allow enough time for some of the general questions that may be helpful to everyone. So we will kind of pick and choose which ones we can answer. But I do want to get started and just give you guys an opportunity to drop in some questions into the Q&A. I still see them coming into the chat, so drop them into the Q&A if you have any questions there. Okay, so um oh, we have some good ones. We have some good ones. Okay, buckle up, y'all. So, Michelle, let me get you ready. Um, Christy asked, does the Fair Election Center categorize all states in terms of level of restrictions for voter registrations as the states that were illustrated as examples previously? So I think what Christy is asking is, do we have a 50 state grouping of each of the restrictive categories that they fall into?
No, not really. It's really provided here for more illustration purposes. So I would say the best thing to do is to look at the individual guides for each state, and what one organization also might find to be a barrier might, another organization might find something else to be a barrier in their state. So it is a bit hard to compare different, different climates.
Yeah, and there's, the 50 states that we want to get to. So we do summarize them for this presentation to make sure that we give like the most pertinent information on what has changed over the past year. So thank you for asking that, Christy, because I know a lot of you are thinking that. On to the next question. So I have a question here from an anonymous attendee about the SAVE Act. And I do want to emphasize again that the SAVE Act, I know as you did, Michelle, has not passed at the federal level. But the question is, help me understand one element of the SAVE Act. I had to show my birth certificate to obtain real ID. So why wouldn't my real ID suffice?
So just it's a bit of a detour to the Save Act. That's cool. Thank you for the question. Real ID may or may not be documented within a state system as you having shown the birth certificate. So if the state system just says this person has shown sufficient documentation for real ID, then because you can have a real ID, whether you're a citizen or have legal presence, it's really to depend on what the state's usually motor vehicle system has in its records about what the documentation is that someone showed to obtain the real ID.
Yeah, great question. Again, the SAVE Act has not passed at the federal level, so we do encourage you to look at your state guides to make sure that you have the most up-to-date information, but it has not passed at the federal level. Deborah asked, are the voter registration guides up to date? For example, I see that New Jersey was last updated May 2026.
Yes, always, always check with your election official, but because changes, can happen, we do our best to keep everything churning. If there are updates in between that time in that year, the month that we were updated the guide and did the research. But typically we pay a lot of attention to things like when the legislative session is over, when the state election officials typically post their own guidance, things like that. So we do our absolute best to make sure that when we are updating them, we've got everything in there that is likely. And then, if things change later in the year, we go back and make updates.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And Michelle, I would also add the Fair Election Center starts this updating process of the guides in April and May, and it takes us this long so that we have the most accurate information. So if it says May, that's because that's probably one of the first that we started with. But it takes
If
a while to make sure that we can get to all 50, and Fair Election Center does a really good job of making sure that we cover all of them. So they
if
are
I
up on the website.
Thank you. If I can add to that too, just one thing to emphasize is that our guides are all human researched. This is not, AI based or anything like that. And there's been a lot of talk, even some articles just in the last week about AI and elections and things like that. And I want to make really clear that our guides are human researched and checked. So yes, it does take a little time because we are human after all.
That's right. We do things the old-fashioned way, no AI. So it takes some time. It takes some time, but they're up to date. And I see all the emojis coming in. We have taken meticulous time to make sure that they are ready for you. Okay, so our next question is a little bit of a long one, but I think it's a relevant one. Do state restrictions apply to people who may not be collecting voter forms or doing the voter registration themselves. For example, passing out literature with a QR code that goes to an organization's voting hub, which includes maybe links to register or check your registration, and having the individual fill out the information themselves.
Um, yeah, I mean, and I'm generalizing here. Please take a look, of course, at individual guides. But generally speaking, if you're handing out a QR code that goes to the state's online voter registration, or you're giving someone a form and then they're going to take it home and, you know, uh, do whatever, fill out their information and send it in themselves, those are typically not considered voter registration drives under state rules. But look at the wording of the rule, meet with your election official if you have a program and you're at all concerned about what applies to you. That's a good conversation to have. But typically handing out information, educating voters without uh, participating in the sort of educational and service step of collecting the application is a different category.
Right. And two related questions, Michelle. Could you briefly discuss how states that offer online voter registration treat registration drives that are really just volunteers with QR codes directing voters to fill out the online form? And do any states consider this a true third-party voter registration drive?
Um, I would refer back to the guides because that's, it's easier to keep it all on paper than all in my head at once. But typically, if people are using the state website and it's not a third party website or anything like that, but it's like the state's, for example, the Secretary of State or State Board of Elections, whichever it is in that state, it's their website and people are filling out their own information and submitting it themselves. Then like typically that would be not in the category of like collecting forms and things like that. But again, like my disclaimer here, check the guides, check with election officials if you are concerned, because it really is, all these things are very much state by state. I know that Kansas has a new rule around website use, for example. So if you're in Kansas and you are looking at online, registration related issues, take a look at that. And then, I think it's also important to note that online registration in it's most states. I think it's about 40 state. No, it's not 40. I'm sorry. Online registration in all but 10 states that have online registration is only for people that have a driver's license or a state, DMV issued ID, in order to like finish that registration online. So, in a lot of states, if you want to be reaching people that don't drive, you really got to be doing paper, because they're just not going to reach the people that frankly need the most outreach to get registered if you're only doing online in those states. There have been an increasing number of states, I think it's about 10 now, that where people can use their social online to finish the online application. So important to know, but paper is key for a lot of folks.
And Michelle, you just answered another question that was in the chat already. Deborah asked, would you recommend that people register on paper or online? So yes, you should absolutely check your state's legislation, but if you have the capacity to do paper forms, you should definitely do those.
Yeah. As far as like an individual voter making a decision, certainly online has benefits in terms of like data entry and clean information. When I say clean, I mean no typos, no, handwriting, reading issues, things like that. Um, so if the individual person has that choice, they may prefer online. But if you're standing there with them, the best way to make sure that someone actually gets registered to vote is if you help them make sure that the application is complete and you submit it for them, because things happen. And if you give someone a form or you just say, "Oh, hey, here's the link," and go register, people get busy, or they don't know where to find a stamp, or they don't know where to mail it, or things like that. So whether it's online or paper, that act of helping them submit it is really important.
Michelle, first of all, these questions that are coming through are fantastic. So thank you so much. Please, we have a few more minutes for Q&A, and we wanted to allocate enough time for these questions to come through. They're quality questions. So drop in your last Q&A questions before we wrap. But Alexis just asked a relevant question as well. She said, I know many of these answers differ by state, so this may be another one, but I was curious on whether or not giving envelopes and stamps for voter registration forms and absentee ballots is allowed.
So um yeah, that is a really state specific question. Typically, that would be a good thing to run by your state election office or your local election official and just make sure that they don't have any issues with that.
That's right.
Because it is important to note that you can't give incentives to register to vote, and that may be what the question was referring to. You have to, have things available for everything. But what we're talking about typically in terms of incentives is a trade. What you can't do is like, hey, I'll give you a pizza if you register to vote. That's no go. That's a violation of federal law and some state laws. But if you give everybody pizza, and it's not an exchange for registering to vote, then that could be a fun event. So
That's right. That's right. And you do want to make your event fun, but they cannot be, you cannot incentivize voter registration. So as Michelle said, you have to make that pizza available for everybody, and not just, you have to register to vote to get a slice. So I hope that makes sense. One question from Nia that I can actually answer is how do we navigate registering unhoused individuals? Great question. And what if they wanted an absentee ballot? And Michelle, I'm sure you can chime in here as well, but that is state specific as well. Some states do require that unhoused individuals have a mailing address, while some states or cities do not. So you do want to check to see what your guide says around unhoused individuals. But I'll hand it to Michelle to add to that.
yeah, and we don't have specific sections, I think, in these guides on that. I think you all might have, NVRD may have different
That's right.
resources
Yeah, we have some
on your side, I
resources.
think. Yeah, and some jurisdictions have specific laws on like, oh, like people who are unhoused can use a shelter or they can use a central location. In some places, it's the elections office that they can use. So, states do have specific, information and rules about that. So yeah, I would say check the NVRD resources and talk with election officials if you're looking to serve, specific unhoused communities in different cities or states.
That's right. In New York City, as an example, you can an unhoused individual can list a street corner as their address, but in some states, they do require a mailing address. So just double check. I have a great question in from Daniel that I'm hoping, Michelle, you can answer. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we're planning a nonpartisan, disability-focused civic engagement event that would include voter registration, information about accessible voting, and other priorities. Are there any legal or IRS compliance concerns with combining these elements into a single event? And what best practices would you recommend to ensure we remain strictly nonpartisan?
Okay, so there's a lot there. I am not an IRS or tax attorney, but again, can't provide legal advice here. I would say that one organization that does a lot of work on 501c3, sort of what 501c3s can do, is Boulder Advocacy. So take a look at their website; they have a lot of resources. But in terms of being nonpartisan, it's about not showing a preference for any candidate or political party. So there's a lot of educational work you can do as a 501c3 when it comes to the importance of voting, the importance of being civically engaged, the fact that issues that people care about are decided at the ballot box, and are uh, a reason a reason to vote, separate and apart from any partisan concern. So that yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and that I think is the extent of what we can answer here. But remaining nonpartisan, I'm sure, is a key for everyone. We actually have a resource from Nonprofit Vote, which Jack can drop into. Oh, He's ahead of it. He's ahead of me already. We have a great resource on staying nonpartisan. This is a conversation that has come up a lot over the past year. So we want to make sure that 501(c)(3)s have the information to make sure that you are running your drive and not running into any compliance issues. So great question. And that concludes our Q&A. There were some questions that came in that we can't speak to because they are either very state specific. So the answer for those would be to check your state guides, which are available now and they're dropped into the chat, or check with your elected official, your election offices to make sure you have the most accurate information. You should do that anyway, but for some of these questions that came in, they are state specific. So that would be the answer to those. Thank you guys so much for those questions. I hope those were helpful. And Michelle, thank you for walking us through those tiers of restrictions. We were not able to get to all 50, but we encourage you to just take the time to look through the guide and to just familiarize yourself with what has changed or may have changed in your state. So Michelle, thank you so much for walking us through that, and to the Fair Elections team for your research every year in making sure that the guides are accurate and helpful to our partners. So we are, before we close out, going to get to some tools and resources because there's a lot of resources. Michelle just dropped in a Fair Election Center link that I encourage you guys to take a look at. But there are a lot of tools and resources that we want to make sure are on your radar, okay? One of the key pieces of feedback that we hear from you all is that you are not totally sure where to start or you're not totally sure where to end. So wherever you are on that spectrum, we have a bunch that we've already created for you and done the thinking for. So be sure to check out our webinars from this year on both the nonprofit vote side and National Voter Registration Day. We've done several webinars across 2026 already that you can catch up with. For National Voter Registration Day, if you guys have not signed on as partners just yet, please do so because the deadline is August 31st. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But our Field Organizer Toolkit is available as well as our Communication Strategy Guide. These are two really key resources. Thank you for the emojis that we work very hard on. Our comms team supports in making sure this is rolled out every single year. So please check those out. You will receive a copy of this presentation as well as the recording. So you'll have all the links, but they're already up on our website, and our social media toolkit is coming up next. We also have a bunch of fact sheets to help you with registering specific types of voters. I want to say that again. Those talking points that you guys asked for, we have created them. You do not have to start from scratch. So whether you're talking to colleges or high school students or libraries or new citizens, that is a new fact sheet that we developed this year in partnership with Welcoming America. How do you talk to new citizens about registering to vote when they may have fears? So I want to make sure that you guys take a look at some of those fact sheets that are available. And in terms of what's next, National Voter Registration Day, as we know, is Tuesday, September 15th. We have over 1,800 local organizations signed up already to run drives in their communities, which we're so excited about in this 2026 midterms year. So if you guys have signed up already, thank you so much. If you haven't, there's the QR code. You will receive a link, and Jack already dropped it into the chat, but the deadline to receive those free posters and stickers is August 31st, so don't miss it. And lastly, check out more resources from both the Fair Election Center that Michelle and her team have created, as well as Nonprofit Vote. You can also donate to make sure you keep all of these webinars and resources free to all. So thank you so much for being here today. We will make sure to share this webinar with you all following. The recording will be shared with you all. I know you're wondering about that. And the state guides are up on the website. I know you still have many questions, so feel free to email us with any questions that you have, but we're so excited that you are doing this work. Thank you for your continued support and dedication, and thank you for being here today. We will see you on the next webinar. Take care.